This is Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. The headlines. Chinese censors block online debate as President Xi is given the right to rule indefinitely, but a few critics speak out.
If a leader stays in office too long, and if power becomes too concentrated, then eventually power becomes evil.
Russia orders a daily 5-hour ceasefire to allow civilians to leave the besieged Syrian enclave of Ghouta.
I'm Sharanjit Lail in London. Also on the programme, India mourns Bollywood's Sridevi Kapoor amid new revelations about how she died. And we visit the resting place of millions of damaged Qurans deep inside these Pakistani mountains.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Glad you could join us. It's 9 in the morning here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London, and 9 in the morning in Beijing, where censors have been deleting online criticism of the announcement that President Xi Jinping could stay in power for decades to come. The proposal would remove a clause in China's constitution that limits the head of state to just 2 terms in office. Some people online have accused the Communist Party of creating a dictator and becoming like North Korea. John Sudworth reports from Beijing.
It's no secret that Xi Jinping has been tightening his grip on power. This is just the most recent display of tub-thumping military loyalty. But now a defining moment has been reached. State media reports of closed-door party meetings confirm that the 2-term limit is to be scrapped. There's nothing to fear, his supporters argue. Mr. Xi, the benevolent father figure, is staying on for the good of the nation.
China has become such a developed country. The middle class is increasing in size as well as in the number of wealth they command. I don't think anyone in China, either in the party or outside of the party, would sit tight to allow the return of a despot or tyrant back onto the political stage.
But one ruler still casts a long shadow here, Chairman Mao. The 2-term limit was introduced after his death to keep tyranny at bay. Jiang Baochen, an activist jailed for mild dissent in the past, is one of the few daring to publicly criticize the change.
If a leader stays in office too long, and if power becomes too concentrated, then eventually power becomes evil.
For most people, though, criticism is best kept in the shadows. The striking of just a few words from China's constitution marks the biggest political shift in decades, with far-reaching implications. Out go regular, orderly transitions as the world's second-largest economy finds itself in the hands of a man with total unfettered power indefinitely. Behind the appearance of strength lies the risk of instability. A rising superpower has just torn up its rulebook. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
And we'll have more on that row about President Xi staying in office in just a moment. But let's take a look at some of the day's other news now. Russia will establish a humanitarian corridor out of Syria's eastern Ghouta and enforce a daily 5-hour ceasefire to allow civilians to escape. More than 500 people were killed in shelling of the rebel-held enclave last week alone. The UN has criticized governments for failing to implement its 30-day ceasefire passed on Saturday.
Security Council resolutions are only meaningful if they are effectively implemented. And that is why I expect the resolution to be immediately implemented and sustained, particularly to ensure the immediate, safe, unimpeded and sustained delivery of humanitarian aid and services, the evacuation of the critically sick and the wounded, and the alleviation of the suffering of the Syrian people. As you know, the United Nations is ready to do its part. As I had the opportunity to say in the Security Council itself a few days ago, in particular, Eastern Ghouta cannot wait. It's high time to stop this hell on earth.
Antonio Guterres there on Syria. Also making news today, Saudi Arabia's King Salman has sacked several of the country's top military commanders in a series of late-night royal decrees. The heads of the air and ground forces were amongst those dismissed. The move comes as the war in Yemen, where a Saudi-led coalition is fighting rebels, nears the end of its third year. And US President Donald Trump has again criticized law enforcement officers for the way they handled the Florida school shooting. During a meeting with state governors in the White House, he suggested he would have been braver than the armed guard who failed to confront the killer.
You know, I really believe, you don't know until you test it, but I think I really believe I'd run in there even if I didn't have a weapon. And I think most of the people in this room would have done that too, because I know most of you. But the way they performed was really a disgrace.
A fifth Briton has died following a helicopter crash in the Grand Canyon earlier this month. Ellie Udall was on honeymoon with her husband John when they were involved in the crash. He died last week. A preliminary report into the accident failed to establish a cause. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been criticized for telling a young girl who was dressed up in military uniform that she would be honored if killed while fighting. In a televised address to his AK party, he told the sobbing girl if she's martyred, they'll lay a flag on her. The speech has been described by some Twitter users as child abuse. Now, Formula One's pre-season testing is underway in Barcelona, and it wasn't a great day for McLaren's Fernando Alonso. Now, the double world champion lasted about 6 laps before losing a wheel and spinning off the track. He was able to return to the track later in the morning, completing another 4 laps. Now, there's been dancing in the streets in Thailand. About 300 enthusiasts grooved to swing music in Nakhon Pathom. That's about an hour away from Bangkok. Swing music's been growing in popularity in the country, and organisers now hope to make the dance festival an annual event.
Long-serving leaders are not uncommon in Asia, but as China's Xi Jinping looks set to erase term limits for the top job, and Cambodia's Hun Sen wants an extra 10 years after 33 years at the helm, are we seeing a growing trend of long-term autocratic power in Asia? Earlier, I spoke to Angela Mancini, a partner at the risk advisory firm Control Risk. I asked her if she was surprised by the social media backlash to President Xi's power plans.
Yeah, a little bit surprised by the level, but to be honest, so what he's done, it's significant and historic. Obviously, he's got the most power of any Chinese leader in 25 years, but it's actually not that surprising. If you remember in the Party Congress in the fall, he didn't name a successor. That was quite significant and kind of gave a little bit of a hint of what was to come. But what he's really done here now is formalize that and send a signal to everybody in the party, but also all the citizens that he's here to stay and you know, not go anywhere. But it's not surprising to see there's been a bit of a backlash, but the level's a bit surprising.
But in your view, is there really a need for Xi Jinping to extend his term beyond 2022? He still has another 4 years to cement his legacy.
Yeah, that's right, and he could go for 10 more. I mean, he's 64 years old. He's pretty young as it relates to, you know, generally speaking, in terms of world leaders. And he's got a lot of ideas, a lot of policies. I mean, he could still get quite a lot done in 4 years that he wants to do. But again, as you know, it's a big, big job to transition the Chinese economy and what they're trying to do. And there's quite a lot to do there. And we could see him staying easily another 10 years.
But Angela, this also could set a bad precedent because there's a risk of a succession crisis down the road.
Yeah, that's exactly the issue there and also other places, because the issue becomes you've now got someone who's extended the term limits. They haven't named a successor. They likely won't for in any medium-term time frame. And so what happens next? What happens when the next person comes around? What does that look like? That really is a serious medium to longer-term risk.
All right, if he stays beyond 2022 for another 8 years, 10 years, or 15 years, what will this mean for the dynamics in Asia?
Well, clearly it's very significant, of course, in China. I mean, of course, his thought, as you know, has now even been written into the Constitution. China's obviously growing. It has having more and more power in Southeast Asia and broader Asia Pacific. And so we just continue seeing that. We continue that going. The positive side would be, of course, there'd be more consistency in things like economic policy making, foreign policy making. So in a way, you have less, you have more certainty in those areas. But it would be quite significant, I think, if he stays in power another 10 years.
One of the longest-serving leaders now in Asia is Cambodia's Hun Sen, 33 years and running, and he wants to stay on for another 10 years. Are we seeing a growing trend of long-term autocratic power in Asia?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I mean, in the case of Cambodia, they can't really be a bellwether because we know he's been there for a long time and he has no intention to leave. We are seeing a rise in the autocratic power. What's interesting that we see that isn't getting a whole lot of headline news is actually those governments' attitude to cyberspace. So a lot of the places like Thailand, Vietnam, and elsewhere are taking a page from China and actually setting up their own cybersecurity laws that allow an incumbent political leader some advantages because they're being able to control and monitor data in ways they haven't before. And that is something that is going to be, we think, quite fundamental as it relates to democracy over time.
And another example, of course, is Malaysia's Prime Minister, 9 years and counting.
Yes, that's right. And there's elections, as you know, scheduled for this year. We expect to control risks that he will win another term. But that, to your point, actually is a risk because he's been in power quite a long time. People are extremely frustrated there by his leadership and all of the corruption scandals, 1MDB, obviously. And so, assuming he wins, and we think he will, the frustration level there will be very high. And that's where we could see people take to the streets.
And briefly, is democracy now under threat in Asia?
It's always been a mixed bag. China and Cambodia aren't democracies, probably never will be. Indonesia, South Korea, and Japan are quite healthy ones, so it's too mixed to say.
Angela Mancini there speaking earlier to Rico. Now, ever wondered what happens to old, unusable copies of the Quran? Well, in Pakistan, thousands of old Qurans are buried under a mountain in tunnels because they're not allowed to be destroyed. Our correspondent Sekunda Kermani sent us this report.
Buried underneath this mountain in Pakistan are hundreds of thousands of copies of old Qurans. Muslims in Pakistan believe you can't throw away old or damaged copies of the holy book, so they're brought here from around the country. The tunnels here stretch for over 2 miles and they're all lined with these sacks, each containing around 8 to 10 Qurans. Most, like this one, are completely filled in. You can't walk along it. Abdul Rashid Lahiri has been helping run the project for the last 25 years after his brother set it up.
My older brother loved Qurans. He used to collect them from gutters and put them into his car. Some of his friends joined him, and then with God's grace all this was established.
Each day, more copies of old Qurans are sent here. Workers separate out what can be preserved and what needs to be disposed of.
Some books like this one are only a bit damaged, so we repair them and give them away. But when pages are torn like these, we bury them in the tunnels.
To keep up with the demand, they're constantly building new tunnels. But cutting into the mountain is hard work.
To dig a tunnel of 200 feet, it takes 4 or 5 months. Some days we only dig around 6 inches because the rocks are very hard.
In Pakistan, disposing of the Quran is a sensitive subject. People have been lynched for not treating it respectfully. The project here is calling for anyone in the country with a damaged copy of the Quran to send it to them. Sekunda Kermani, BBC News, Quetta.
You're watching Newsday on the BBC, live from Singapore and London. Still to come on the program. On shaky ground, what is behind the recent flurry of earthquakes in the Asia Pacific?
And also on the program, India mourns Bollywood actress Sridevi as new details emerge about her death. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Sharon Chicklale in London. Our top stories. Online critics of China's plan to allow President Xi extra time in office have found their comments censored.
Russia says there will be a daily 5-hour pause in the fighting in rebel-held eastern Ghouta in Syria from Tuesday. And a mother and her 3 children narrowly escaped a fire in Houston, Texas. Their apartment complex caught fire and firefighters to get them out. This story is popular on bbc.com. Let's now take a look at some of the front pages from around the world, and we start off with Singapore's Straits Times newspaper, and it looks at the jump in salary that Singapore's graduates can expect. Apparently, some former students took home $4,000 to $5,000 a month, with business and computing being the best earners. Shifting now our attention to the China Daily, and it features some colorful images taking place as part of the Chinese Lunar New Year festivities. Well, that includes this snap of a fire dragon dance performed at a Buddhist temple in Brazil. It all comes ahead of the Lantern Festival, which gets underway in March. Let's now turn the page to the international edition of the New York Times, and it wonders if Harry Potter will manage to keep his powers on Broadway. Well, the 8th installment of the celebrated Wizarding saga cast a spell over London. Now they're hoping to pull off the same trick in the Big Apple. You know, Sharon, when I was in London last year, I couldn't even get a ticket. They were sold way in advance. And now, which stories are sparking discussions online?
Well, Rico, it's not even about tickets. The stories online all focused on toilet paper because, of course, the Taiwanese obsession with it is back in the news again. Last time it was because the paper was being stolen. Now there's been a panic about price rises and stores are running short. That's a story that's proven popular on bbc.com.
The leader of the UK's main opposition Labour Party says he wants Britain to remain in a customs union with the EU after Brexit. Well, the policy shift could lead to Labour siding with government rebels to defeat Theresa May on her Brexit strategy. A spokesman for the Prime Minister repeated the government's position that Britain would not be in the customs union and the UK would be free to strike its own trade deals. Here's a little of what the opposition leader said earlier.
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland.
Now, the Asia-Pacific region has been hit by a series of earthquakes in the last few weeks that have left a trail of damage and destruction. A 7.5 magnitude earthquake took place on Monday in Papua New Guinea. Indonesia was also hit with a 6.1 magnitude earthquake off the eastern coast on the same day. Now, this follows a 5.5 earthquake off Japan on Sunday. And earlier this month, Taiwan was hit by a quake in the town of Hualien, where the bodies of the last 2 victims of the disaster have finally been removed. And just last week we also saw a couple of earthquakes close to New Zealand. So, are earthquakes happening more frequently, especially in the Asia-Pacific region? And if so, why? Well, earlier I spoke to Gary Gibson, the founder of the Seismology Research Centre, who's also Principal Research Fellow for Seismology at the University of Melbourne. I started by asking him if all this seismic activity is somehow related.
One of the things about earthquakes is that they cluster, and we have periods where they're quiet and the periods where they're active. We had about 14 years from about 1977 with only 1 magnitude 8 earthquake in the world, and the last 14 years we've had about 1 a year. They just vary. Overall, though, I don't think there is an increase in the actual rate. We're just hearing about them more better.
All right, but this suggestion that they are cluster earthquakes suggests they are somewhat related. So should countries on the same fault line then perhaps be on alert?
Not necessarily. Usually it's only a local phenomena, and large earthquakes in Papua New Guinea will not trigger earthquakes elsewhere. They very rarely do, but it's not common.
Right. Now, we know that technology and earthquake reporting, part of what you do, is becoming far more sophisticated. So is there this sense that perhaps there's this perception that earthquakes are happening more frequently because the technology's gotten so good?
Oh, yes. Nowadays, we've got a lot of data sharing. Seismology is a very cooperative science, and we share data online, real time, and normally we can get preliminary locations of earthquakes within about 20 minutes of them occurring.
So basically you're saying you can actually now predict when the next big one will take place?
No. I'm sorry, we can't do that yet. And I don't think we ever will, really. Most earthquakes happen out of the blue and with no indication that anything's going to happen. Some of them have foreshocks, and a few earthquakes in continental regions seem to have unusual activity for about a year beforehand, or a few years. But most of them, they come out of the blue.
So what would you suggest as a seismologist? What kind of safeguards can be put in place to potentially protect populations, evacuate people in time?
By far the best thing is building standards. The difference in the quality of building and the casualties in an earthquake, it's just remarkable. I visited Chile after their magnitude 8.8 earthquake in 2010, and there were casualties, but for such a huge earthquake, very, very few.
Seismologist Gary Gibson there, speaking earlier to Sharon. The Bollywood superstar, known simply as Sridevi, died of accidental drowning, according to a forensics report in Dubai. Sridevi Kapoor drowned in her hotel apartment's bathtub following loss of consciousness, according to the post-mortem. Earlier, it had been reported that the 54-year-old actress died of a heart attack. The BBC's Suranjana Tiwari explains.
Here at one of Sridevi's family homes, fans have been coming to pay their respects all day. Dubai police today released the post-mortem results, saying that her actual cause of death was drowning in the bathtub of her hotel apartment. Now that was different from earlier reports that said she actually died from a cardiac arrest while attending a family wedding in Dubai. Now her body was allegedly delayed because of the results of the report. That's what local media were reporting in Dubai. Politicians, fellow celebrities and fans have been reacting in utter shock at the news of her death. She's being described as Bollywood's first female superstar. Since starting acting at the age of 4, she acted in more than 300 films, and it wasn't just Bollywood she acted in. She was a star of many regional film industries across India. One of the real appeals of Sridevi, especially since she came to Bollywood in 1978, was that she was seen as one of the few female stars who was able to carry a film and deliver box office success without the need for a male co-star. Celebrities have been coming into the night to pay their respects here at this family home, and her funeral is expected on Tuesday, and there will be plenty more people coming to pay their tributes to this great actress for her final journey. Suranjana Tiwari, BBC News, Mumbai.
And you've been watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Rico Hizon in Singapore. Stay with us. What will a revamped Trans-Pacific Partnership mean for the New Zealand economy? We'll be hearing from the country's new finance minister on whether he thinks TPP will really make a difference.
And before we let go, let's take a look at these pictures from a snowy Europe. Yes, it is getting cold, and the so-called beast from the east is making its presence felt. And this priest outside St. Peter's is certainly enjoying it. Over in Switzerland, though, no one's going very far on this bicycle as the big freeze hits the banks of Lake Constance. And Germany is experiencing very low temperatures, -8 in Munich for these brave swimmers, and a record -27 Celsius on a mountain in the Alps.